Rachel Elridge was 19 when she first touched the flight controls of an abandoned simulator buried beneath Hangar 7 at Grayson Air Force Base. She had found it by accident while sweeping the lower maintenance wing at midnight, the screen flickering like a dying heartbeat, the oxygen mask still hanging from its hook like a forgotten dream. For 8 years, she had been invisible. The janitor's daughter who pushed mop buckets down corridors where legends walked, who emptied trash bins beside briefing rooms where missions were planned. Every morning at 0500 hours, she clocked in alongside her mother, Susan Elridge, who had worked janitorial shifts at the base for 15 years. Every evening they clocked out together, their uniforms stained with the honest sweat of work nobody else wanted to do. But Rachel carried a secret that would have shattered every assumption on that base. Growing up on Grayson meant learning. To walk beside jet fuel tanks, taking first steps across oil-stained hangar floors, and memorizing call signs before she could spell her own name. Her father had died in a lumber mill accident in Kentucky when she was 5, and after that, the Air Force Base became her second parent. The roar of engines was her lullaby, the smell of aviation fuel her comfort. By 16, Rachel had studied every flight manual she could find, most of them torn, coffee-stained, or tossed into trash bins. She photographed the pages, printed them at the public library, and devoured them at night while her mother rested her aching knees. Her favorite was a weathered Air Force training guide with faded ink and a ripped corner on page 217, the page that described emergency dive maneuvers. She read it until she had it memorized like scripture. The broken simulator in Hangar 7 became her cathedral. She paid Roger Matthews, a grumpy mechanic with a soft spot for Susan, to help her fix it. He never asked questions when she slipped him $20 from her part-time job at the base commissary. "Just keep it between us," she'd whisper. And Roger would nod, understanding that some dreams were too fragile for daylight. Night after night, Rachel trained in silence. She used discarded flight suits to practice cockpit movements, whispered commands in the dark using a pencil as a control stick. She aced every simulation, scored higher than the average cadet on mock tests she recreated from overheard training sessions. Through thin metal walls, she listened to real pilots stumble. Through emergency drills she could execute in seconds. But no one knew. No one asked. Because to them, she was just Rachel, the janitor's daughter with grease under her fingernails and a name no one bothered to remember. The irony wasn't lost on her. Every day she cleaned the offices of men who couldn't fly half as well as she could. She wiped down the desks of instructors who failed students with more skill than they possessed. She mopped the floors where pilots strutted in their pressed uniforms, never imagining that the girl pushing the bucket could outfly them all. Sometimes, when the base was quiet and the last jet had landed, Rachel would stand alone on the tarmac and look up. She'd watch the contrails fade against the darkening sky and imagine herself in the cockpit, her fingers steady on the stick, her breath even, her mind sharper than steel. She'd whisper flight checklists under her breath, reciting them so often they became part of her heartbeat. Colonel James Hawthorne commanded the 47th Fighter Squadron, and to him, Rachel was furniture. Worse than furniture, furniture served a purpose. She was just another invisible body in janitor's clothes, someone who appeared to empty his trash and disappeared before he had to acknowledge her existence. He had a habit of dropping his coffee cups near her feet when she was mopping, never looking at her face, never saying thank you. "The help should be invisible," she once heard him tell another officer. "The moment you start seeing them as people, efficiency drops." Rachel had perfected the art of invisibility. She moved through the base like a ghost, present but unseen. Listening but unheard, she learned which officers were kind, which ones were cruel, and which ones were simply indifferent. She memorized their schedules, their habits, their weaknesses. What they didn't know was that she was studying them, learning from them, preparing for a day that might never come. The warning signs were always there. The way Colonel Hawthorne's jaw tightened when he saw her mother struggling with heavy equipment. The dismissive glances when other officers mentioned the maintenance staff. The casual cruelty of men who had forgotten that power was meant to serve, not dominate. Rachel felt the injustice in her bones, but she swallowed it down like bitter medicine. She had learned early that speaking up meant being seen, and being seen meant being vulnerable. So she stayed quiet, stayed invisible, and nursed her secret dream in the darkness of Hangar 7. But secrets have a way of demanding to be told, and Rachel's was about to explode into the light in ways she never could have imagined. The morning everything started to unravel began like any other. Rachel was refilling the coffee station outside the pilot briefing room when she overheard Captain Douglas Peterson bragging about his latest simulator score. "Pulled a 94 on the high-altitude intercept drill," he announced to his fellow pilots, chest puffed with pride. "Instructor said it was one of the best rookie performances he'd seen." Rachel nearly choked on her silence. She had run that same simulation 3 nights ago and scored a perfect 100, twice, but she kept her head down, continued restocking the coffee filters, and pretended she hadn't heard. "Not bad, Peterson," Colonel Hawthorne's voice cut through, the morning air like a blade. "Though I'd hope our pilots could do better than not bad when lives are on the line." The group of pilots shifted uncomfortably. Rachel could feel the tension thickening like fog. "Sir, the high-altitude intercept is one of the most challenging," Peterson began. "Challenging?" Hawthorne's laugh was sharp and cold. "Son, if you think that's challenging, you're not ready for real combat. Half the pilots in this squadron couldn't handle a real emergency if their lives depended on it. Hell, I bet even the janitor's daughter could do better." The words hung in the air like a slap. Rachel's blood turned to ice. The pilots laughed. Nervous, uncomfortable laughter that made her stomach churn. She wanted to speak up, wanted to tell them exactly how wrong they were, but the words stuck in her throat like shards of glass. "Speaking of which," Hawthorne continued, his voice dripping with disdain, "where is our little cleaning lady? Rachel, isn't it? Come here." Rachel's hands trembled as she set down the coffee filters. She turned slowly, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Yes, sir?" Hawthorne's eyes were cold as winter steel. "I want you to listen very carefully. This is a restricted area during morning briefings. You need to finish your work before 0700. Hours, not during. Do I make myself clear?" "Sir, I was just—" "Did I ask for an explanation?" His voice rose just enough to make the other pilots step back. "This is a military installation, not a charity case. We don't need the help getting in the way of real work." The dismissal in his tone was like a physical blow. Rachel felt 8 years of silence and swallowed pride rising in her throat like bile. "I understand, sir," she managed to whisper. "Good. And Rachel?" He waited until she met his eyes. "Next time you want to eavesdrop on classified briefings, remember that some conversations are above your pay grade. Far above." The laughter that followed her out of the room was like acid on her skin. Rachel made it to the supply closet before the tears came, hot, angry tears that she wiped away with the back of her hand. She thought about the simulation she'd run the night before, perfect execution, perfect score. While Peterson had struggled with basic maneuvers, she had completed the course flawlessly, her virtual aircraft dancing through the sky like it was an extension of her own body. But none of that mattered. In their eyes, she would always be just. The janitor's daughter, invisible, insignificant, unworthy of respect. That afternoon, Rachel was cleaning the windows in the pilot's lounge when she heard her name again. This time it was Captain Lisa Reynolds, one of the few female pilots on base, talking to Lieutenant Mark Johnson. "Did you hear what happened this morning?" Reynolds asked, her voice low. "Hawthorne completely humiliated that girl, the janitor's daughter." "Rachel?" Johnson said quietly. "Her name is Rachel." "Right. I felt bad for her. She was just doing her job." Johnson nodded. "Hawthorne's been worse lately. The pressure from command is getting to him." "Word is they're not happy with our simulator scores." Rachel's ears perked up. She continued cleaning, moving slower to catch every word. "Maybe if he spent less time bullying support staff and more time actually training his pilots?" Reynolds muttered. "Careful, Lisa. You know how thin the walls are around here." But Reynolds wasn't finished. "I'm serious, Mark. Something's got to give. Half our squadron can barely handle basic maneuvers, and he's worried about coffee station schedules. We're going to get someone killed!" The words hit Rachel like lightning. She knew exactly what they were talking about. She'd been watching the pilot performances for years, listening to debriefings, studying their mistakes. Most of them were decent pilots, but they lacked the precision and instinct that separated good from great. She also knew something else, something that made her heart race with possibility and terror in equal measure. The base was scheduled for an inspection next month, a high-stakes evaluation that would determine funding, personnel, and the future of the 47th Fighter Squadron. She'd overheard enough conversations to know that Grayson was on thin ice, and their pilot performance scores were a major concern. As she finished the windows and gathered her supplies, Rachel caught her reflection in the glass. For just a moment, she didn't see the janitor's daughter. She saw a pilot, someone who belonged in a cockpit, someone who could outfly half the men who had laughed at her that morning. But the moment passed, and she was just Rachel again. Invisible Rachel, with her mop and her secrets and her impossible dreams. She didn't know it yet, but Colonel Hawthorne had just made the biggest mistake of his career. He had underestimated the wrong person, and that underestimation was about to cost him everything. The first crack in her armor of silence had appeared, and soon the whole facade would come crashing down. 2 weeks after the coffee station incident, Colonel Hawthorne implemented new efficiency protocols that felt more like punishment than policy. The janitorial staff was now required to complete their work in half the time with twice the scrutiny. Effective immediately, Hawthorne announced during the morning briefing that Rachel was now forbidden to attend. All maintenance personnel will be evaluated on a daily basis. Any disruption to flight operations will result in immediate review of employment status. Susan Elridge came home that evening with worry lines etched deeper into her face. "They're watching us like hawks, honey," she told Rachel as they ate their simple dinner of canned soup and crackers. "Mrs. Patterson from the commissary said they're looking for reasons to cut staff before the inspection." Rachel's jaw tightened. She knew exactly what this was about. Hawthorne was covering his own failures by creating scapegoats. If the 47th Fighter Squadron performed poorly during the inspection, he could blame it on distractions and inefficient support staff. The next morning, Rachel arrived at work to find a new schedule posted outside the janitorial office. Her heart sank as she read it. She was now assigned to clean the pilot simulation bay during peak training hours. It was a deliberate setup designed to put her in the way of flight operations so Hawthorne could document her interference. As she pushed her cart toward the simulation bay, she passed the maintenance hangar where Roger Matthews was working on an engine. He looked up as she approached, his weathered face creased with concern. "Rachel, you need to be careful," he said quietly, glancing around to make sure they weren't overheard. "Word is Hawthorne's gunning for your mom's job. He's been asking questions about the janitorial staff, looking for any excuse to make cuts." Rachel's blood ran cold. "What kind of questions? Productivity? Reliability? Whether civilian contractors might be more cost-effective?" Roger's expression darkened. "That man's looking for a fall guy, and your family's an easy target." That afternoon, Rachel was mopping the floor outside the simulator bay when she heard familiar voices inside. Through the partially open door, she could see Captain Peterson struggling with the same high-altitude intercept drill that had been mentioned weeks ago. "Damn it," Peterson muttered as warning alarms blared from his simulator. "I can't get the angle right on the dive sequence." His instructor, Major Williams, sounded frustrated. "You're overthinking it, Peterson. Trust your instincts." "My instincts are telling me this is impossible," Peterson snapped back. Rachel paused in her mopping, unable to help herself. She knew exactly what Peterson was doing wrong. He was approaching the dive too steep, not accounting for the wind resistance at that altitude. The solution was simple: a graduated descent with power adjustment at 45,000 feet, then a sharp correction at 30,000. "Sir?" Peterson's voice cracked with desperation. "Can we review the manual one more time? I'm not getting something fundamental here." Through the crack in the door, Rachel watched as Major Williams rubbed his temples. "Peterson, you've been at this for 3 hours. The inspection team will be here in 2 weeks, and you're one of our designated demonstration pilots. We don't have time for fundamentals." Rachel's heart raced. She knew she could help, not just Peterson but half the pilots on this base. She had solutions to problems they'd been struggling with for months, but speaking up meant exposing herself, and exposure meant vulnerability. As she wrestled with the decision, footsteps echoed down the corridor. Rachel quickly resumed mopping, but it was too late. Colonel Hawthorne rounded the corner, his cold eyes immediately focusing on her. "What are you doing here?" he demanded. "Cleaning, sir, according to my schedule." "Your schedule doesn't include lurking outside classified training sessions." His voice carried the sharp edge of authority. "How long have you been standing there?" "I was just mopping, sir. I didn't hear anything." Hawthorne stepped closer, his presence intimidating. "Let me be very clear, Rachel. Your family's employment here is contingent on your ability to do your job without creating problems. Eavesdropping on pilot training is a security violation. Do I make myself clear?" The threat was unmistakable. Rachel nodded, her throat tight with suppressed anger. "Good. And Rachel?" He waited until she met his eyes. "I'll be watching you very closely from now on. One mistake, just one, and you and your mother will be looking for new jobs. There are plenty of people who can push a mop without causing security concerns." As Hawthorne walked away, Rachel felt something crack inside her chest. It wasn't just the injustice of his words or the cruelty of his threats. It was the waste of it all, the knowledge that she could solve their problems, improve their performance, help them succeed, but instead she was being pushed further into the shadows. That evening she found herself in Hangar 7 earlier than usual, her fingers flying over the simulator controls with desperate precision. She ran the high-altitude intercept drills 17 times, achieving perfect scores on each attempt. With every successful run, her frustration grew. She wasn't just better than Peterson, she was better than most of the pilots on this base. She had solutions they needed, skills they lacked, knowledge they desperately required. But none of that mattered because of who she was, or more accurately, who they thought she was. As she powered down the simulator, Rachel made a decision that terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. She couldn't speak up directly. That would only make things worse for her and her mother. But maybe there was another way. Maybe she could help without revealing herself, at least not yet. She thought about the upcoming inspection, about the pilots struggling with maneuvers she had mastered years ago, about Colonel Hawthorne's threats and his desperate attempts to find someone else to blame for his squadron's shortcomings. An idea began to form in her mind, dangerous, audacious, and possibly brilliant. She would need to be careful, strategic, and above all, patient. But for the first time in 8 years, Rachel Elridge was ready to fight back. She just hoped she was strong enough to handle the consequences. The breaking point came on a Tuesday morning when Rachel discovered her mother crying in the supply closet. Susan Elridge sat hunched over a mop bucket, her shoulders shaking with quiet sobs. In her hands was a formal written warning, the kind that preceded termination. "Mom?" Rachel's voice was barely a whisper. Susan quickly wiped her eyes, but couldn't hide the tremor in her voice. "It's nothing, honey. Just some paperwork." Rachel knelt beside her mother and gently took the document. Her blood turned to ice as she read it. The warning cited inefficient work performance and failure to maintain professional standards. It was signed by Colonel Hawthorne and dated that morning. "What happened?" Rachel asked, though she already suspected the answer. "I was cleaning the officers' conference room during the night shift," Susan explained, her voice hollow. "I must have accidentally knocked over some papers from Colonel Hawthorne's desk. They were just scattered on the floor, nothing damaged, but—" She trailed off, unable to finish. Rachel's hands clenched into fists. She knew those papers. Flight performance reports, simulation scores, inspection preparation documents. All of it pointing to the same conclusion. The 47th Fighter Squadron was failing, and Hawthorne was desperately looking for someone to blame. "Mom, this isn't your fault. You've been doing this job perfectly for 15 years. "That's what I thought," Susan said quietly. "But maybe I'm getting too old for this. Maybe my reflexes aren't what they used to be." "Don't say that." Rachel's voice carried an edge of steel that surprised them both. "This isn't about your work. This is about him covering his own failures." That afternoon, Rachel was reassigned to clean Colonel Hawthorne's office, a task that felt more like a trap than a duty. As she dusted his desk, she couldn't help but notice the documents spread across it: performance reviews, inspection criteria, and a draft memo that made her stomach turn. The memo was addressed to Base Command, recommending immediate reduction of civilian support staff to improve operational efficiency and reduce security risks. Her mother's name was at the top of the list, but what caught Rachel's attention was a folder marked Classified Inspection Scenarios. Inside were the exact flight maneuvers that would be tested during the upcoming evaluation. She recognized every one of them: complex high-altitude intercepts, emergency landing procedures, formation flying under stress conditions. She also recognized something else that made her heart race. These were the same scenarios she had been perfecting in the simulator for years. Every single one. As she continued cleaning, more pieces of the puzzle fell into place. A conversation log showed that 3 pilots had requested additional simulator time for the inspection, but been denied due to scheduling conflicts. A performance analysis revealed that the squadron's average scores were 15 points below the acceptable range. Colonel Hawthorne was setting everyone up to fail: his pilots, his support staff, even himself. But he was too proud and too scared to admit that the problem might be his leadership. That evening, Rachel found herself in Hangar 7 with a sense of purpose she had never felt before. She loaded the exact inspection scenarios into the simulator and began working through them systematically. Not just flying them, but analyzing them, breaking down every component, understanding not just how to succeed, but how to teach others to succeed. By midnight, she had formulated complete training protocols for each scenario. Step-by-step instructions that could turn struggling pilots into competent ones, solutions that could save careers, prevent accidents, and restore the squadron's reputation. But she was still just the janitor's daughter, and her solutions would die in the shadows unless she found a way to bring them to light. The next morning, Rachel made a decision that would change everything. She couldn't save her mother's job by staying invisible, and she couldn't live with herself if she watched good people fail when she had the power to help them succeed. She spent her lunch break in the base library, researching military protocols, whistleblower protections, and chain-of-command procedures. What she found gave her both hope and terror. There were official channels for reporting misconduct, but using them meant stepping into the light and accepting whatever consequences followed. As she walked back to work, Rachel noticed Captain Reynolds struggling with paperwork outside the pilot's lounge. The female pilot looked exhausted, frustrated, and completely overwhelmed. "Mom?" Rachel's voice was quiet but steady. "Are you all right?" Reynolds looked up, surprised. "Oh, Rachel, right? I'm fine. Just preparing for this inspection. Sometimes I wonder if any of us are really ready." Rachel took a deep breath, feeling as if she were standing at the edge of a cliff. "Captain Reynolds, can I ask you something? If someone had information that could help the squadron succeed, but that person wasn't supposed to have access to that information, what would you do?" Reynolds studied Rachel's face carefully. "That's a very specific hypothetical question." "Yes, ma'am, it is." "Well," Reynolds said slowly, "I suppose I'd want to know what kind of information we're talking about, and I'd want to make sure that person understood the risks involved." Rachel nodded, her heart hammering. What if that person had been watching, learning, and training in secret for years? What if they had solutions to problems the squadron didn't even know existed? The silence stretched between them like a taut wire. Finally, Reynolds spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Rachel, are you telling me what I think you're telling me? I'm telling you that sometimes the people you don't see are the ones who see everything." Rachel's voice was stronger now, filled with 8 years of suppressed truth. "And sometimes they're ready to step out of the shadows." Captain Reynolds stared at her for a long moment, then glanced around to make sure they weren't being overheard. "Meet me in Hangar 7 tonight at 2200 hours. And Rachel, come prepared to prove everything you just implied." As Rachel walked away, she felt the weight of her secret beginning to lift from her shoulders. The breaking point had been reached, and there was no going back now. Tomorrow, Colonel Hawthorne would discover that he had been systematically underestimating The most dangerous person on the base, the janitor's daughter, was about to become his worst nightmare. Captain Lisa Reynolds arrived at Hangar 7 at exactly 2200 hours, her expression a mixture of skepticism and curiosity. She found Rachel already at the simulator, the screens glowing in the darkness like electronic stars. "All right, Rachel," Reynolds said, crossing her arms. "I'm here. Now convince me I haven't lost my mind." Rachel's hands moved across the controls with practiced precision, loading the first inspection scenario. "Captain, what's the average squadron score on the high-altitude intercept maneuver?" 73%. Why?" "Because I can show you how to get it to 95% in 2 weeks." Rachel's fingers danced over the keyboard, bringing up a detailed analysis she had prepared. "The problem isn't pilot skill, it's approach methodology." Reynolds leaned forward, her skepticism beginning to waver. "Show me." For the next hour, Rachel demonstrated techniques that she had perfected through years of secret training. She broke down complex maneuvers into teachable components, identified common mistakes, and provided solutions that were both practical and effective. "How long have you been doing this?" Reynolds asked, her voice filled with amazement. 8 years. Every night, whenever I could get access to the simulator." Rachel's hands never stopped moving, her confidence growing with each successful demonstration. "And I've analyzed every pilot's performance, studied every failure, and developed training protocols that could revolutionize how this base approaches flight instruction." Reynolds was quiet for a long moment, processing what she had witnessed. "Rachel, this is incredible, but it's also complicated. You're not enlisted, you don't have security clearance, and you're a civilian contractor. The chain of command issues alone?" "I know," Rachel interrupted. "But, Captain, the inspection is in 10 days. Colonel Hawthorne is planning to throw my mother and other support staff under the bus when the squadron fails. I can't let that happen when I have the power to prevent it." "What are you asking me to do?" Rachel turned to face her fully. "Help me get this information to the right people. There has to be someone in command who cares more about mission success than protecting egos." Reynolds nodded slowly. "There might be. Major Williams has been pushing for training reforms for months, and General Morrison, the base commander, has been asking hard questions about our readiness. Then we need to get to them before Hawthorne sabotages any more careers." The next morning, Captain Reynolds requested a private meeting with Major Williams. She presented Rachel's analysis carefully, framing it as alternative training methodologies discovered through unofficial channels. Major Williams was initially skeptical, but as he reviewed the data, his expression changed from doubt to amazement to determination. "Where did this come from?" he asked. "Someone who's been watching our failures and developing solutions, someone who cares more about the squadron's success than getting credit." Williams studied the documents for several minutes. "These methodologies, they're not just good, they're revolutionary. The approach to formation flying alone could save us dozens of training hours." He looked up at Reynolds. "I need to meet this person." "Sir, that might be complicated. There are political considerations." "Captain, I don't care if this analysis came from a janitor or a general. If it can help our pilots succeed, I want to know more." Reynolds smiled. "Funny you should mention janitors, sir." That afternoon, Williams found himself in the unusual position of requesting a meeting with Rachel Elridge in a secure conference room. When she arrived, still wearing her maintenance uniform but carrying a thick folder of documents, he understood why Reynolds had mentioned political complications. "Ms. Elridge," Williams began carefully, "Captain Reynolds has shared some very impressive analysis with me. Analysis that could significantly improve our squadron's performance." "Yes, sir. I hope it's helpful." "It's more than helpful. It's exactly what we need. But I have to ask, how did you develop this level of expertise?" Rachel met his gaze, steadily. "By watching, learning, and practicing. By caring about the success of this base and the safety of its pilots. And by having access to equipment that most people assumed I couldn't understand." Williams leaned back in his chair. "Ms. Elridge, what I'm about to tell you is confidential. Our squadron is on the verge of failing the upcoming inspection Careers will be ended, funding will be cut, and this base could be downsized significantly. Your analysis could prevent all of that. I understand, sir. The question is, are you prepared for the consequences of stepping forward? Because once this gets out, there's no going back to being invisible. Rachel thought about her mother's tears, about Peterson's struggles, about Colonel Hawthorne's threats, and the waste of 8 years spent hiding her abilities. Sir, I stopped being invisible the moment I decided to help. I'm ready for whatever comes next. Williams nodded. Then we need to move fast. General Morrison is scheduled to review inspection preparations tomorrow morning. I want you there. Sir, I don't think Colonel Hawthorne will appreciate. Colonel Hawthorne's preferences are no longer my primary concern. Williams cut her off. Mission success is, and right now, you represent our best chance of achieving it. That evening, Rachel returned to Hangar 7 with a sense of anticipation and terror. She spent hours preparing for the most important presentation of her life, organizing her data, practicing her explanations, and mentally preparing for the firestorm that was sure to follow. As she worked, she thought about the 8-year-old girl who had dreamed of flying, the teenager who had taught herself aerodynamics from discarded manuals, and the young woman who had perfected her skills in secret while the world dismissed her as invisible. Tomorrow, Rachel Elridge would step into the light and show them exactly who she had always been. The only question was whether they would be ready to see her. The conference room felt like a courtroom when Rachel walked in the next morning. General Morrison sat at the head of the table, his weathered face unreadable. Major Williams was to his right with Captain Reynolds beside him. Colonel Hawthorne occupied the opposite side, his jaw tight with barely contained fury. General Morrison, Williams began, I'd like to present Ms. Rachel Elridge and her analysis of our squadron's training protocols. Hawthorne's voice cut through the air like a blade. Sir, with all due respect, this is highly irregular. Ms. Elridge is civilian support staff. She has no business in a classified briefing about flight operations. Colonel, Morrison's voice carried the weight of absolute authority. Major Williams requested this meeting. I'm interested in hearing what Ms. Elridge has to say. He turned to Rachel. Proceed. Rachel's hands trembled slightly as she opened her folder, but her voice was steady. General Morrison, our squadron's current training methodology is failing because it focuses on individual skill development rather than systematic problem-solving. The pilots aren't lacking talent, they're lacking proper instruction. She spread her analysis across the table, 8 years of secret study distilled into clear, actionable recommendations. For example, Captain Peterson has been struggling with high-altitude intercept maneuvers, but the issue isn't his flying ability. The current training protocol teaches a 60-degree dive angle, but wind resistance at that altitude requires a graduated approach starting at 45 degrees. Morrison leaned forward, studying the documents. You've tested this methodology? Yes, sir, extensively. I've run every inspection scenario multiple times, identified the specific failure points, and developed solutions that improve success rates by an average of 23%. Colonel Hawthorne's face had turned red. General, this is preposterous. She's a janitor. She doesn't have access to classified training materials or flight simulators. This has to be some kind of security breach. Actually, Colonel, Rachel interrupted, her voice gaining strength, I do have access. I've been training on the simulator in Hangar 7 for 8 years. Every night, while you and your officers went home, I stayed here perfecting techniques that your pilots are still struggling with. The silence in the room was deafening. Morrison's eyes moved from Rachel to Hawthorne and back again. Ms. Elridge, are you telling me you've been using military equipment without authorization? Yes, sir, I am. Rachel's chin lifted defiantly. I'm also telling you that I can outfly half the pilots in this squadron, and I have the skills to train them to succeed where they're currently failing. Hawthorne exploded. This is outrageous. General, she's admitted to unauthorized use of classified equipment, possible theft of training materials, and security violations that could... Colonel Hawthorne, Morrison's voice was dangerously quiet. I'm more interested in results than protocol violations right now. Ms. Elridge, can you demonstrate these abilities? Yes, sir. Right now, if necessary. Morrison stood up. Then that's exactly what we're going to do. Colonel, I want you to select your best pilot for a comparison demonstration. Major Williams, prepare the simulator bay. We're going to settle this once and for all. 30 minutes later, a crowd had gathered in the simulation bay. Word had spread through the base. Like wildfire, the janitor's daughter was claiming she could outfly trained military pilots. Some came to watch the spectacle, others came hoping to see Colonel Hawthorne taken down a peg. Captain Peterson was selected as the comparison pilot, a choice that made Rachel's heart race with irony. The same man who had struggled with maneuvers she had mastered years ago would now be her direct competition. The scenario is high-altitude intercept, Morrison announced to the assembled crowd. Standard inspection protocol. Captain Peterson will go first. Rachel watched as Peterson climbed into the simulator, his movements tense with pressure. Through the viewing window, she could see his hands shaking slightly as he ran through the pre-flight checklist. The simulation began, and Rachel immediately spotted the mistakes she had observed countless times before. Peterson approached too steep, overcompensated for wind resistance, and lost valuable time in the recovery phase. His final score was 76, respectable, but not impressive. Ms. Elridge, Morrison's voice cut through the murmur of the crowd. Your turn. Rachel walked to the simulator with steady steps, ignoring the whispers and stares that followed her. As she settled into the pilot's seat, something shifted inside her. This wasn't the hidden practice of midnight sessions. This was real, public, and irreversible. Her hands moved over the controls with fluid precision, each motion the result of thousands of hours of secret training. The simulation began, and Rachel felt the familiar rush of virtual flight, but this time she wasn't alone in the darkness of Hangar 7. This time everyone was watching. She executed the maneuver flawlessly, her virtual aircraft moving through. The scenario like it was choreographed. Perfect angle, perfect timing, perfect recovery. When the final score appeared on the screen, 98 out of 100, the room fell silent. General Morrison was the first to speak. Run it again. Rachel repeated the simulation, this time scoring a perfect 100. Then she ran a third scenario she hadn't been asked to perform, demonstrating advanced evasive maneuvers that even veteran pilots struggled with. The silence stretched until Morrison finally spoke. Colonel Hawthorne, I believe you owe Ms. Elridge an apology, and then you owe me an explanation for how the most talented pilot on this base has been pushing a mop for 8 years while your squadron fails basic competency tests. Hawthorne's face had gone from red to pale. General, there are protocols. She's not enlisted. She's also not the problem, Morrison cut him off. The problem is a command structure so rigid and prejudiced that it can't recognize talent when it's literally cleaning the floors beneath its feet. The crowd of pilots and personnel began to murmur among themselves. Rachel could hear fragments of conversation, amazement, disbelief, and more than a few expressions of guilt from officers who had dismissed her for years. Captain Reynolds stepped forward. General Morrison, if I may, Ms. Elridge has developed comprehensive training protocols that could revolutionize our approach to pilot instruction. With your permission, I'd like to propose immediate implementation of her methodologies. Absolutely not, Hawthorne's voice cracked with desperation. General, this sets a dangerous precedent. We can't have civilian contractors. Colonel, Morrison's tone could have frozen jet fuel. You're dismissed. Report to my office at 1400 hours. We need to discuss your fitness for command. As Hawthorne stalked out of the simulation bay, his career effectively over, the remaining officers turned their attention back to Rachel. She stood beside the simulator, still wearing her maintenance uniform, but somehow she looked different. Now, the invisibility had been stripped away, revealing someone who belonged in that room more than many of the people who had ignored her for years. Major Williams approached her with something approaching awe. Rachel, I owe you an apology. We all do. The question now is, what do you want to do with these skills? Rachel looked around the room at the faces watching her, some friendly, some skeptical, all finally seeing her as something more than furniture. I want to help, she said simply. I want to train your pilots, improve your scores, and make Sure, this squadron succeeds, not for recognition, not for revenge, but because it's the right thing to do. General Morrison nodded slowly. Ms. Elridge, effective immediately, you're being transferred from janitorial services to a special advisory position in flight training. Your mother's job is secure, and your family will receive full base housing and medical benefits. The transformation had begun, but Rachel knew the real work was just starting. She had spent 8 years preparing for this moment, and now she would have to prove that her skills could translate from secret practice to real-world results. 3 days before the inspection, alarms began to blare across Grayson Air Force Base. Rachel was in the middle of conducting her first official training session when the sirens cut through the morning air. Urgent, sharp, repeating faster than anyone had heard before. Unidentified aircraft breach detected, the voice crackled over the loudspeakers. All available pilots report to Hangar 1 immediately. This is not a drill. Within minutes, the base descended into controlled chaos. Rachel watched as pilots sprinted past the training facility, their faces tight with tension. Through the window, she could see General Morrison himself emerging from the operations center, his expression grim. "What's happening?" Captain Peterson asked, his voice tight with anxiety. Rachel's blood ran cold as she overheard radio chatter through the open door. "High-altitude breach at 50,000 feet. Unknown aircraft, possible hostile intent, need immediate intercept capability." She knew that profile. It was the exact scenario she had been perfecting for years, the one that had been pulled from regular training after 2 accidents. The altitude drop interception maneuver that required split-second timing and perfect execution. Captain Reynolds burst into the training room, her face pale. "Rachel, they need you. Now." "What do you mean?" "Every qualified pilot for that altitude is either off base or failed the simulation this week. Peterson's the only one left, and he—" She looked at Peterson apologetically. "You barely passed the basic version yesterday." Peterson's face went white. "I can't handle that maneuver at combat altitude. I'll get myself killed." Through the radio chatter, Rachel heard the words that made her heart stop. "We have no pilot available with the reflexes for that altitude. Every qualified officer failed the simulation." General Morrison's voice cut through the chaos as he approached their building. "Where's Elridge?" "The civilian trainer?" Captain Reynolds met him at the door. "Sir, she's here, but she's not certified for—" "I don't care about certifications right now, Captain. Can she fly that maneuver or not?" Rachel stepped forward, her heart hammering. "General Morrison, I've run that simulation over 300 times. I know every angle, every wind variance, every possible failure point." Morrison stared at her for a moment that felt like an eternity. "Ms. Elridge, I'm about to ask you to do something that goes against every regulation in the book. Are you prepared to get in a real aircraft and execute a maneuver that has killed experienced pilots?" The weight of the moment pressed down on her like gravity itself. 8 years of hiding, 8 years of dreaming, 8 years of perfect simulations had led to this single question. "Yes, sir, I am." 20 minutes later, Rachel found herself being fitted with a flight suit that was too large and a helmet that felt both foreign and familiar. The entire base seemed to be watching as she walked across the tarmac toward the F-16 that sat ready, its engines already screaming with power. Colonel Hawthorne appeared beside General Morrison, his face a mask of desperate concern. "General, this is insane. She's never flown a real aircraft. The liability alone—" "Colonel, you're relieved of duty pending investigation." Morrison cut him off fast. "Ms. Elridge is our only option right now, and frankly, after what I've seen, I trust her abilities more than your judgment." As Rachel climbed the ladder to the cockpit, her mother appeared at the edge of the crowd. Susan Elridge stood there, in her work uniform, tears streaming down her face, watching her daughter prepare to do something that should have been impossible. Their eyes met across the distance, and in that moment, every sacrifice made sense. Every hidden training session, every swallowed insult, every moment of invisibility had led to this. Rachel settled into the pilot's seat and felt something click into place, not just physically, but spiritually. Her hands moved across the controls with the muscle memory of 1,000 simulations, but this time the vibration was real, the stakes were life and death, and the entire base was holding its breath. "Elridge, confirm readiness," came the voice. Through her headset, she pressed the communication button, her voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment. "Ready for takeoff." The jet shot down the runway like a fired bullet, and Rachel felt every doubt, every fear, every moment of uncertainty vanish in the roar of the engines. This wasn't a simulation anymore. This was real flight, real purpose, real proof of everything she had always known about herself. At 30,000 feet, the world spread out below her like a map of possibilities. The breach aircraft appeared on her radar, small, fast, and weaving in a pattern designed to confuse pursuit aircraft. "Elridge, target acquired. Beginning intercept. Sequence." What happened next would be talked about at Grayson Air Force Base for decades to come. Rachel executed the high-altitude intercept maneuver with a precision that defied belief. She predicted the target's movements, matched its evasive patterns, and completed the intercept in half the time it took experienced pilots. When she landed 20 minutes later, the entire base was waiting on the tarmac. As she climbed down, from the cockpit, her legs shaky but her spirit soaring, she was greeted by silence. Then General Morrison began to clap. Captain Reynolds joined him, then Peterson, then every pilot and officer who had witnessed what just happened. The applause built until it echoed across the entire base. "Ladies and gentlemen," Morrison's voice carried across the crowd, "meet the newest member of our elite flight squadron, and perhaps the most naturally gifted pilot any of us will ever see." Rachel looked out at the faces surrounding her, the same faces that had ignored her for 8 years, now looking at her with respect, amazement, and something approaching awe. But the person she sought was her mother, still standing at the edge of the crowd, still crying, but now smiling through her tears. 8 years of silence were finally over. 6 months after that life-changing flight, Rachel Elridge stood in front of the mirror in her new quarters, adjusting the silver wings pinned to her flight suit. Lieutenant Rachel Elridge, United States Air Force, the fastest civilian to officer. Promotion in base history. The transformation of Grayson Air Force Base had been swift and dramatic. Under Rachel's training protocols, pilot performance scores had improved by an average of 34%. The base not only passed its inspection, but received commendations for operational excellence. 3 other military installations had requested copies of her training methodologies. Colonel Hawthorne had been quietly transferred to a desk job. At a logistics depot in Nevada, the official report cited failure to recognize and utilize available resources and systematic undermining of personnel potential. He never flew again. Rachel's mother had been promoted to head of facilities management with a salary increase that allowed them to move out of base housing and into a comfortable home in town. Susan Elridge now oversaw a staff that included several of the officers who had once treated her as invisible. But the most satisfying change was in the pilots themselves. Captain Peterson had become one of Rachel's most dedicated students, his performance improving so dramatically that he was being considered for advanced flight training. Captain Reynolds had been promoted to major and put in charge of implementing Rachel's training methods base-wide. This morning was special. Rachel's first solo training mission as a qualified instructor pilot. As she walked across the tarmac toward her aircraft, she passed the maintenance hangar where her journey had begun. Roger Matthews looked up from his work and grinned. "Morning, Lieutenant. Ready to show those rookies how it's done?" "Always. Ready, Roger. Thanks for believing in me when it mattered." "Hell, I just fixed a simulator. You did everything else?" The flight went perfectly. 3 new pilots executing maneuvers that would have been impossible under the old training system. As Rachel watched them succeed where others had failed, she felt the deep satisfaction of purpose fulfilled. That evening, she found herself back in Hangar 7, not to train in secret, but to check on the new simulation equipment that had been installed. The old broken simulator that had been her refuge for 8 years sat in the corner, retired but preserved, as a reminder of where it all began. General Morrison appeared in the doorway, a smile creasing his weathered face. "I thought I might find you here." "Just reminiscing, sir." "Any regrets about staying quiet so long?" Rachel considered the question. "No, sir. I think everything happened exactly when it was supposed to. I needed those 8 years to become good enough to matter, and the base needed to fail badly enough to be ready for change." Morrison nodded. Wisdom beyond your years, Lieutenant. Speaking of which, I have news. The Pentagon has requested a briefing on your training methodologies. There's talk of implementing them across all flight training facilities. That's incredible, sir. There's more. They're also considering you for the test pilot program, experimental aircraft, cutting-edge technology, the kind of flying that pushes the boundaries of what's possible. Rachel's eyes lit up. After 8 years of hiding and 6 months of proving herself, the idea of pushing those boundaries felt like the natural next step. I'm interested, sir. I thought you might be. The interview process starts next month, but Rachel? He paused, his expression serious. Whatever you do next, wherever your career takes you, remember that you've already accomplished something remarkable here. You've shown that talent can come from anywhere, that potential can't be measured by background or expectations. After Morrison left, Rachel stood alone in the hangar where her secret had been born and nurtured. She thought about the scared 19-year-old who had stumbled across a broken simulator, the young woman who had taught herself to fly in darkness and silence, and the pilot she had become. Her phone buzzed with a text from her mother. "Proud of you every day, sweetheart. Dad would be too." Rachel smiled, thinking about the father she barely remembered, but who had somehow passed on the courage to dream beyond circumstances. She thought about all the young people who might be hiding talents the world wasn't ready to see, waiting for their moment to step into the light. As she walked back to her quarters under a sky full of stars, Rachel Eldridge carried with her the knowledge that sometimes the most powerful revenge isn't getting back at those who wronged you. It's becoming so successful that their opinions become irrelevant. She had spent 8 years invisible, overlooked, and underestimated. Now she was exactly where she belonged, not because someone gave her permission, but because she had earned it through skill, determination, and the quiet courage to never stop believing in herself. The janitor's daughter had become a legend, and her story was just beginning. In the distance, jets thundered across the night sky, carrying pilots trained in her methods, executing maneuvers perfected through her dedication. Rachel watched them, climbed toward the stars, and smiled, knowing that sometimes the best way to prove you belong in the sky is to spend years learning to fly in the shadows. She had waited 8 years for her moment. It had been worth every silent second. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and become a part of our Everyday Life Stories community. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. We love hearing from our amazing viewers around the world.